On June 2nd, 1890, a census taker knocked on the door of nearly every home in America. They came with a new form, more detailed than any before it. For the first time, each family got their own separate sheet, not grouped with neighbors, not lumped into a column. A sheet that asked about home ownership, immigration status, ability to speak English, Civil War service, how many children had been born and how many were still alive. It asked about debt, about race, in 7 distinct categories, about whether you were literate. Nearly 63 million people answered those questions. 46,000 enumerators fanned out across the continent to collect the answers. It was the most granular portrait of an American population ever assembled, and it captured something that no other document could: the exact moment the old America ended and the new one began. The frontier had just officially closed. The great wave of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe was at its peak. The industrial cities were filling faster than anyone could count. Entire communities of people who had arrived from Poland, Italy, Russia, and China within the previous decade were being documented for the first time, with their actual names, their actual origins, their actual circumstances. That census sat in a file room in the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C., without fireproof protection, without copies filed anywhere else in the country, for 31 years. Then it burned, and then, 12 years after it burned, Congress authorized its destruction. One day before laying the cornerstone for the National Archives, start with what was in that basement. The 1890 census was the first in American history to use Herman Hollerith's electrical tabulating system, a machine that read data punched into cards, allowing results to be processed in months rather than the decade it had taken to tabulate the 1880 count. The technology was revolutionary. The data it processed was irreplaceable. What the 1890 schedules contained, specifically, the name, age, sex, and race of every person in the country, the number of years each immigrant had been in the United States, whether they had been naturalized, whether they could speak English, the occupation of every working adult, the number of months unemployed during the census year, whether the family owned their home or rented, and whether they were in debt. For married women, the number of children born and the number still living. For the first time, the census asked about Civil War veterans by name, their unit, their length of service, their disability status. Hundreds of thousands of surviving soldiers and their widows were documented individually. It was the only snapshot of American life taken between 1880 and 1900, the 2 decades that contained the closing of the frontier, the explosive growth of industrial cities, the largest wave of immigration the country had ever seen, and the first generation of formerly enslaved people living as free citizens trying to build documented lives. Gone. All of it gone. And the story of how it went is not the story you were told. The standard account says the 1890 census was destroyed by fire in 1921. That is true in the way that saying a person died is true. It tells you the outcome while skipping everything that matters. On the evening of January 10, 1921, a building watchman at the Commerce Department noticed smoke rising through an elevator shaft. He called the fire department. For hours, firefighters soaked the building with water to fight the flames. When the smoke cleared, archivists waded ankle-deep through the flooded basement to assess what remained. Here is the first detail the standard account skips: the census records from every other decade, 1880, 1870, 1860, all the way back, were stored in a fireproof, waterproof vault in the basement. They survived without damage. The 1890 records were stacked outside the vault, next to the boiler room, in a regular file room with no special protection. The only census in American history stored without fireproof protection. The only one that happened to be in the most vulnerable possible location. 25% of the 1890 schedules were destroyed outright by fire. Another 50% were damaged by water, soaked, warped, but physically present. Archivists who examined them in the days after the fire said they could be dried and transcribed to new volumes. The director of the Census Bureau at the time, Sam Rogers, initially expected that many of the schedules would survive. But then something happened that the fire itself did not cause. The water-damaged records were moved to a temporary warehouse, and then they sat. For months, historians and genealogists wrote letters demanding action. The National Genealogical Society and the Daughters of the American Revolution formally petitioned Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce, and Congress. They urged immediate preservation efforts. The replies they received were consistent. There were no plans to destroy the records. The situation was being handled. By May 1921, the still damp volumes were transferred back to the Census Bureau building. And then the documentation goes quiet. What is known from archival records is that no serious preservation effort was mounted. The paper continued to deteriorate for years in storage conditions that were not designed to halt the process. I want to be careful here about what is documented and what is inference. The fire was almost certainly accidental. The mismanagement of what survived is documented, but not definitively explained. What is documented is this. The records were placed in a vulnerable location before the fire. The records were not preserved effectively after the fire, and 12 years later, they were authorized for destruction. Sit with that timeline, 12 years. The records sat damaged but physically present for 12 years. Modern archival science has recovered documents in far worse condition. The technology to do so existed. The will to do so apparently did not. In December 1932, the chief clerk of the Bureau of Census sent the Librarian of Congress a routine list of papers no longer necessary for current business and scheduled for destruction. Item 22 on the list read, Schedules, Population, 1890, Original. The Librarian of Congress reviewed the list. He identified no records as permanent. The list was forwarded to Congress. On February 21, 1933, Congress authorized the destruction of the 1890 census records. One day earlier, February 20th, 1933, President Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building, the institution specifically created to ensure that records of national significance would never again be lost to fire, flood, or administrative neglect. One arm of the government was laying the foundation for a building designed to preserve exactly what another arm of the government was authorizing to destroy. On consecutive days, in the same city, the destruction was confirmed by a handwritten note found later in a Census Bureau file. It read, Remaining schedules destroyed by Department of Commerce in 1934, not approved by the geographer, not approved by the geographer. Someone in the Census Bureau had objected. The note survived. The schedules did not. What remains today is 3 rolls of microfilm covering fragments from 11 states and the District of Columbia. 3 rolls. From a census that documented 63 million people across a continent. The fragments include parts of Perry County, Alabama, parts of the District of Columbia, scattered counties in Georgia, Illinois, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, South Dakota, and Texas. That is it. The rest is gone. What this means practically, if your family was in the United States in 1890, and the vast majority of American families were, there is no federal record of their existence during that decade. The gap between the 1880 and 1900 census is 20 years of documented silence, and 1890 sat directly in the middle of it, the most detailed record that had ever been made, capturing a country in the exact moment of its most dramatic transformation. Genealogists call it the brick wall, the gap where families disappear, where immigrant ancestors who arrived in the 1880s and 1890s cannot be traced because the document that would have captured them was placed outside a fireproof vault, left to deteriorate for 12 years, then authorized for destruction by a government that was simultaneously building a building to prevent exactly that. Here is the question the official histories tend to move past quickly. The 1890 census was the first in American history to be stored without local copies filed in county clerk's offices. Every previous census, from 1790 through 1880, had required copies to be filed locally. The 1890 census did not. The original and presumably only copies were forwarded to Washington. That decision was made before the fire, before the building, before any of it. Someone decided for the first time in 100 years of census taking that local copies were unnecessary, that everything should go to one place, and then that one place burned. I am not claiming this was intentional. The decision to eliminate local copies may have been bureaucratic, cost-cutting, a consequence of the new centralized tabulating technology. There is no documented evidence of deliberate destruction, but there is a pattern that appears across the history of American records from this era with uncomfortable consistency. The Peshtigo fire, The Chicago Fire, the 1890 census, the records of formerly enslaved people, the records of orphan train children, each one a different story, each one a different set of explanations, each one leaving the same gap, in the same decade, at the same moment of transition. The 1890 census would have told us, in more detail than any other document, exactly who was in this country at that moment, exactly who had come from where, exactly who was living in which city, working in which factory, owning which land, paying which debts, exactly which families were present in 1890 and which were not. That information no longer exists. 3 rolls of microfilm. In 1942, the National Archives received a damaged bundle of 1890 schedules from Illinois, found during a Census Bureau move. Nobody knows how they survived. Nobody knows why they were still there. In 1953, fragments from 10 other states turned up, also found during a records move, also without explanation. The paper had outlasted the authorization to destroy it, somewhere in a box, unnoticed, for decades. The people it documented were already gone. Their children were mostly gone. Their grandchildren were building families with no knowledge of what had been recorded about their ancestors in 1890, because that knowledge had been destroyed by a combination of fire, negligence, bureaucratic decision, and a day's timing that remains one of the strangest coincidences in American administrative history. February 20, 1933, cornerstone for a building to protect records forever. February 21, 1933, authorization to destroy the ones already lost. The building opened in 1937. It stands today on Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C., holding hundreds of millions of documents in climate-controlled vaults. The 1890 census is not among them. What would have been in those schedules? The names, the origins, the debts, the children, the languages, the occupations of 63 million people at the hinge of American history is a question that cannot be answered. Not because the information was never collected, because it was collected, stored in one place without copies, placed outside a fireproof vault, left to deteriorate for 12 years, and then destroyed. The same government that did all of that built a building the next day to make sure it never happened again.